Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the launch of Decision Points, Rationalising the Armed Forces of Medium European Powers, a paper that has been written jointly by the military sciences team here at RUSI and aims to set out the key decisions or choices that must be made as part of the UK's integrated review of defence, foreign policy and development. I must highlight, however, that many of the choices actually go a lot further than just the UK and are also ones that confront France, Germany, and a range of other medium powers, although to varying degrees. Now, if we think about the security environment, unfortunately, things are not looking good. In 2014, Russia seized Crimea and has since waged a war against Ukraine in the Donbass. They've conducted expeditionary operations in Syria, Libya, and a range of covert and more clandestine operations across Africa. China, meanwhile, has used its armed forces to seize territory that it had previously recognized to be part of India, and has also essentially ignored its obligations, treaty obligations towards the UK with regards to Hong Kong. The US has recognized the Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, has conducted an assassination of a senior officer of another state which it is not at war with, and has essentially stepped out of a number of arms controls agreements that have underwritten much of the last 3 decades of security of the global security order. And so hard power, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be very critical, unfortunately, to ensuring the state's interests in this renewed era of great power competition. And in that context, there are some really hard choices that medium powers face, because between the increasing cost of modern military platforms at the high end, combined with the lower barrier of entry for highly lethal systems, what we are seeing is trying to maintain a very wide range of military capabilities across domains where fleets are getting smaller and smaller, and in approaching the point where they're not actually able to field militarily relevant force packages and project them. And so we have to essentially prioritize. Now, the book is broken down into the primary domains of land, sea, and air, and also examines C2, command and control, and resilience and contingency with regards to the reserves. Each author at this launch will have 5 minutes to briefly outline what they can in that short time frame from their chapters about that future operating environment and about the choices in their given domain. And then we will move on to Q&A. So I will hold them pretty rigidly to the time so that we can get through as many questions as possible. We won't get through all of the contents of the paper in this presentation, but for that reason, I urge you to go and read it afterwards. And with that, I would like to hand over to Professor Peter Roberts, who wrote the first chapter concerning command and control. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks, Jack. The prerequisite to success in complex military operations is command and control. These are different things, command and control. One might contrast two approaches. One has evolved against the experience of combat operations. It's decentralized at an increasing level. Authorities, permissions, and delegations have been delegated, and those delegations have increased to lower levels. Layers of command have been removed, greater focus to be placed on human understanding and behavior. Assumptions have been made over operating in a denied electromagnetic spectrum that favors a dispersed and delegated approach to control. There have been deliberate breaking down of fused, combined, and joint staffing on the basis of inefficiencies in such a system. More effective and impactful decisions has been the driver for change here, with the result of a more agile, focused, and newest approach by specialists, by geography, as well as fighting domain. This is the approach adopted by the West's adversaries. By contrast, Western militaries have succumbed to a predominantly US view that good C2 can substitute for scale and capability in meeting and overmatching an adversary. To many military and political leaders, the fusing of command and control, systematizing of processes, adding automated analysis and prediction can place the right force in the right place at the right time and unhinge even the most impressive of adversaries. This idea permeates the concepts of multi-domain operations in the US, information in the UK, and possibly, although we've yet to see it, the integrating operating concept. Western command and control has developed, therefore, a heady taxonomy and related science, but in simple terms has evolved into a doctrine that is information dependent, highly centralized, restrictive in granting freedoms and permissions to subordinate levels, slow, unwieldy, fragmented, and indecisive. Judging by behaviors, processes, and procurement plans, the ambition of Western states continues these trends, increasing centralization, adding layers, and becoming even more dependent on the promise of a technological nirvana to remove the fog of war. The majority of Western militaries are aligned over their vision of a future C2 domain, a recognition that pursuing integration at the highest levels, fusing data, massing intelligence, working collaboratively and harmoniously are vital strands against agile adversaries who haven't stood still yet. This path is culturally and historically incompatible with the normalized narrative of mission command. This contradiction envisions mission command alongside the centralized integration and control seems unlikely to be addressed until states in the West acknowledge there are trade-offs that are required to match the demands of the future operating environment. In my chapter on C2 in this paper, I lead to 5 big decisions that I talk about. Firstly, to lead or to follow, to prioritize alliance compatibility and thus subordination to an alliance leader versus sovereignty. Secondly, which ally to follow, the high-tech and higher revolutionary pace of the US model, or a broader alignment to NATO, which entails lower technology and evolution at the speed of the lowest common denominator. Thirdly, the areas in which technology will be allowed to lead and support, and the areas where human cognition will remain the primary operating assumption. Fourthly, whether processing will move to the edge, supporting deployed forces, or be focused on a central node. And fifth, the extent to which joint, combined, and integrated models of C2 are pursued. Given the financial restrictions, limits on people, and the need to do at least one part of command and control well, rather than lots of it poorly, these are becoming pretty much binary choices. Whatever solution is pursued, one must accept the realities of the battle space. Adversaries have the ability and the will to disrupt across the electromagnetic spectrum, across kill chains, access routes, supply chains, partnerships and alliances, as well as a range of lethality of weapons they're now employing. All this makes independent military action on a sovereign basis a very challenging proposition. Decisions in Western command and control, and I would emphasize these are separate things, need to recognize all of these facets and make some really clear choices, whilst accepting that perfection in command, control, or situational awareness will never happen. Jack, back to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And to summarize what you've said, it might well be said that in the C2 domain, the first choice is recognizing that there are choices to be made. And with that, I would like to go to Dr. Siddharth Kaushal, the Sea Power Fellow here at RUSI, who will talk about choices for naval forces.
Right. Well, thanks very much, Jack, and good afternoon to all of you. So, I mean, in many ways, what we see in the maritime domain follows on from what Professor Roberts said. There is a fundamental trade-off facing European powers about whether they would like to be part of a primarily US-led force capable of actually exercising sea command as traditionally understood, or whether they might aim for the more limited aim of windows of sea control, albeit with forces that are both more sovereign in terms of their C2 capabilities and their enablers, and capable of multiple missions beyond sort of regional sea command against a near-peer adversary. So there are basically two sort of major trends that are really underpinning the choices facing middle power navies. The first is political. The US as an ally, as a primary alliance leader in a European context cannot necessarily be relied on in all circumstances. And this is not a new phenomenon. Studies going back to 2007 show a decades-long erosion in congressional bipartisanship on foreign policy related bills. This will only be exacerbated by the pivot to Asia, the emphasis on China. The second is more technological, that old models of power projection where large platform-centric forces establish command of the sea and effectively use it as a maneuver space are being challenged by reconnaissance strike complexes. It's been the case for some time now that missiles like the DF-21D can target a vessel up to 2,000 kilometers out to sea. But what we're seeing now is that adversaries have not just the missiles, but particularly a very developed one, such as China, have not just the missiles, but the system of systems, the over-the-horizon radar, the synthetic aperture radar constellations, to actually leverage the latent potential of these assets. And this will arguably become more of a challenge going forward as sort of complex ISTAR extends beyond states to a variety of commercial actors. You know, some larger companies expect to have satellite constellations capable of surveying the Earth's surface on a daily basis within a decade or so, to give you an example. So there are two sort of broad responses to this sort of operational environment. The first is the US response, which is distributed lethality, a shift from an emphasis on single large platforms in the maritime domain to a sort of larger numbers of single mission platforms, some of them optionally manned, some of them entirely unmanned, essentially facing an adversary with two things: an expanded magazine depth and fewer single points of failure. This would also entail a significant shift in the philosophy underpinning C3I. For example, this is, the best example of this is DARPA's idea of mosaic warfare, the idea of reconstitutable C3I to cope with an information denied environment, where junior level commanders relying primarily on AI-enabled decision-making aids can construct kill chains on the go using access to local forces. Essentially, the idea is to overwhelm an opposing sort of anti-access system by complexity. Now, if European middle power navies want to be part of this system, they could. This is one historical response to revolutionary sort of technological changes, what we might call bandwagoning, relying on a larger partner for the enablers that one can't develop, whether that's in the area of AI-enabled C3I or the sort of ISTAR assets that enable the kill chain, whilst collectively providing the mass to establish command of the sea in a near-peer competition in Europe. This would also go some way to solving the political problem of the US commitment to Europe, because it would enable the US to sort of lead from behind, so to speak. But it would involve two things: a sacrifice of sovereignty and a sacrifice of the ability to conduct missions in an extra-European context, or in a context that does not involve the US or NATO. And that brings me to the second option, which you might call asymmetry, attempting effectively to do two things: provide niche offsets to a larger ally's capability, providing offsets in areas where they are providing capabilities in areas such as the Persian Gulf, which the US is pivoting away from, or the sort of lower intensity competitions we're seeing in areas like the Eastern Mediterranean and Libya, which the US will perhaps be less capable of committing to in future time periods, and perhaps providing and producing forces capable of creating windows of sea control for tasks such as peripheral raiding in wartime. The force capable of executing this would be much more evolutionary when compared to the maritime forces of today. Assets like carrier-enabled power projection, amphibious strike assets would still have a role, albeit it might well be the case that their range and firepower would need to be extended by things like the use of unmanned assets or the use of penetrating MALE UAS in the case of amphibious forces. So SSNs, again, could play a critical role in tasks such as raiding Russia's Arctic seaboard in Murmansk, and power projection assets could play a more well-delineated role in the high-intensity fight in terms of things like raiding, short windows of strategic raiding against, for example, critical ports or critical military infrastructure. In effect, it would be an approach that focused more on versatility in peacetime and windows of sea control in wartime, one that would enable the individual European middle power to work outside a US context in frameworks such as the UK-French CJEF, but would mean sacrificing the more maximalist wartime aim of command of the sea in a near-peer contest. So those are the two ideal typical choices that my chapter lays out. And with that, I'll yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much, Sid. And I'd highlight there that the reason why these decisions have to be made now is because the lead time on developing these capabilities is so great that at the point where that's relevant, we need to start producing those capabilities now if we want to change. So to address the land domain, I think the thing that distinguishes land warfare from the others is that it is about holding the ground, and it's much more permanent than either sea control or air supremacy. The challenge, therefore, at a strategic level in defining the capabilities we need is understanding what land we are trying to contest and how confident we can be about the boundaries of where we are contesting. Obviously, if there's a lot of uncertainty, if we could be asked to deploy anywhere, that has a whole series of forcing functions on the types of land forces that we prioritize. But beyond that, another critical element of land warfare is its asymmetry. It's much easier to hold land than take it. The capacity to take land is what ultimately defines militaries and high-end militaries over militias and forces that are irregular. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what is the system of capabilities that allows us to conduct that function? And really, there are two options. One of them we're pretty familiar with. It's traditional ground maneuver comprising main battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, engineers, air defense, and reconnaissance. And it's worth highlighting, if you don't have any one single bit of that system, the whole thing doesn't work. So when we talk about these sorts of capabilities, we can't just talk about main battle tanks. It's the whole package. Now, that is a very effective way of generating combat power. It will take ground very quickly if deployed at sufficient scale. And realistically, sufficient scale for offensive operations is a division, which in terms of what that corresponds with in terms of numbers, you're talking at 170 main battle tanks on the field as basically your minimum threshold of a credible capability. If you can't field that, you're not really conducting that type of warfare. There is an alternative, because every single vehicle in that heavy formation weighs above 40 tons. The heavier ones weigh over 70. It's a real effort to sustain them, project them, and you have to have them as a whole force package. So that becomes quite a heavy, blunt instrument that you can only choose to deploy or not, very binary policy options. There are alternatives. One would be the reconnaissance strike complex, which essentially uses a dense screen of reconnaissance assets, UAVs, EW sensors to detect the enemy, uses blunting forces of infantry holding strong points, mainly backed by small pockets of armor and anti-tank capabilities to fix opponents once you identify their axes of advance, and then very heavy volumes of long range and precision firepower that can smash up those units essentially once you've identified where they are. Now, in wargaming and in testing, that is a perfectly viable system of fighting if you have all the component parts. But you are having a trade-off. It's not going to be able to take ground nearly as quickly because the vehicles can't put themselves at risk. What you buy by pursuing that capability is much more flexibility, because the majority of the vehicles in that force could potentially be lighter than about 25 tons, and you don't have nearly as many logistics constraints. So it's not necessarily a more powerful force, but it is a very effective one. The second thing that we need to think about in terms of choices is where lethal autonomy and autonomous vehicles fit into this, because we've heard a lot about boots and bots working together, but the reality, that's seen as a way potentially of bridging this weight problem versus deployability. If you don't have people in the vehicles, then you can reduce the weight on protection, but maintain the firepower. You have to make a couple of really clear choices. One is a political decision. How far are we prepared to go with lethal autonomy? Because that dictates what functions that can take over on the battlefield, and therefore the system needs to go in place to support and implement those capabilities. And the second thing is, do we hold our assets in terms of our enablers at echelon, or do we make them organic to units? That sounds quite technical, but what that essentially means is, let's say I have a bridging piece of equipment. Do I hold it at the brigade headquarters, or do I have it organic to the battle group? One is a much more efficient way of managing logistics and enablers. The other one is a much more flexible way of doing it, so that you have highly enabled units. And whereas historically we've kind of mixed and matched with our approaches on that question, depending on the situation, with autonomous systems, you're not really going to be able to mix and match in that way, because the digital architecture will dictate how those systems are employed. For example, if I have an autonomous bridge at my brigade headquarters, do I hand over control to the battle group when it goes and supports them? Are they now responsible for maintaining the command link? Can that be intercepted by the enemy, or do I command it from my command post? In other words, it becomes quite a rigid and binary decision. And so we need real clear guidance, because there are political taboos which are constraining the military's ability to answer those questions. Now, there are a range of other clear decisions that have to be addressed in the land domain that I do go into in my chapter. I think given CGS's speech yesterday, you can see the direction of travel that the British Army has indicated that it's taking. But as I'm out of time, I will hand over to my colleague, Justin Bronk, who will deliver 5 minutes on aircraft. Justin.
Thanks, Jack. I will attempt to stick to 5 minutes, never easy on aircraft for me. So in the chapter that I've written on air power outlook, I think I've taken a slightly more theoretical approach in some ways to my colleagues looking at the maritime and land domains, partly because of the inherent flexibility of air forces. Most things that can either put a sensor payload or weapon systems in the air at distance can be used across a variety of different force designs. But to me, at least, there are two absolutely core decision points that will drive what air forces can offer medium powers in terms of politically relevant options. The first one is whether to develop, or rather redevelop, a credible suppression or destruction of enemy air defenses capability. So SEAD, DEAD. This used to be something which Italy and Germany in particular specialized in within the NATO alliance in Europe with the Tornado and the HARM missile. But those capabilities are now hugely outclassed by the latest generation of Russian and Chinese long-range and medium-range air defense systems. So really what you're left with at the moment in the NATO alliance is a situation where there is no really credible SEAD or DEAD capability outside the United States. A handful of F-35s coming into frontline service among various medium air forces will help, but they don't in themselves constitute a SEAD capability at any scale, and certainly not sufficient to spearhead a non-US led campaign. So for many countries, there may be a decision that the standoff munitions, the penetrating intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, reconnaissance, ISTAR assets, and the high-end training that is required for a modern SEAD capability is simply out of their reach. It's not financially viable, and the opportunity cost, if it is financially viable, is too great across all the other capabilities that medium forces want to field. But the problem with that being that there is an enormous bottleneck in alliance capability, and therefore there is also an incentive for any medium power which does manage to regenerate a credible SEAD capability against modern systems, because they will then be the only non-US alliance member that can contribute that, and therefore have a lot more say in how the early stages of any future campaign are conducted. It's worth remembering that when you discuss strategic long-range SAM systems, as well as their use in integrated large-scale networks, this is not just a peer threat question anymore. These systems S-300, S-400, HQ-9 are proliferating widely across the world. There's, of course, Iran, presence in Syria now, but even Algeria operates S-400 as well as Khrushchev-4 and is looking at getting SA-17 as well as some Chinese medium-range SAMs. This is starting to show the picture for the future, I would say, which is that even for what we would have termed near-peer or sub-peer intervention operations, there is going to have to be a serious coordinated SEAD operation before any other air forces are going to really be combat relevant. So whether medium forces decide to prioritize that or not will greatly shape what sort of political options they give to their countries. But if they do choose to go down that route, there will be a huge opportunity cost in terms of the more traditional non-penetrating assets, for example, big wing ISTAR or mobility, which they can then afford to field, because modern SEAD is really expensive, particularly in terms of munitions penetrating ISTAR and the training involved. The second and related decision point is whether to pursue lethal autonomous weapon systems in the form of UCAVs, so unmanned combat aerial vehicles. These are distinct from the remotely piloted UAVs, such as Reaper and Predator, that are synonymous with counterinsurgency, in that they are designed to be survivable and they are by necessity capable of high-end automation, verging on significant autonomy and lethal effects. They have to be, because if you want a UAV to be credible in high-intensity warfighting against a modern opponent, you can't rely on a data link. So that means no remote control. You might choose to remotely control them in scenarios where you can, but if you're designing UCAVs for high intensity combat, they have to be able to operate in a comms denied environment. So China, the United States, Russia are all pursuing UCAVs fairly openly at this point. The United States still in the black world, but it is going on at a fair scale. The UK and France have fielded demonstrators in the form of Tyrannus and Neuron, but so far no medium power has openly gone after UCAVs. There have been hints in the UK with Lanka or Mosquito, depending on what you want to call it. But essentially, I think this is where the really key second decision point is. Do you pursue UCAVs accepting that A, they will only be applicable legally and ethically for high intensity combat, and B, there will have to be a serious debate around lethal autonomy and how you regulate that? Or do you accept that it is something you're not prepared to do, but that other states will continue to do so, and you may therefore have to A, integrate with, and B, potentially fight against or be prepared to deter forces that have gone down that path, which will then be able to leverage a much, much greater cost per, a much better amount of combat power for a given cost, because if you buy UCAVs with a high degree of autonomy, you don't need to train aircrew. So that means you can get a given frontline strength without an operational conversion unit, without various other frontline squadrons, in order to get the aircrew trained and current and then rest period. So you can get a lot more for your money. We may decide not to do that. Other states will. Anyway, I realize I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Justin. And for those who are watching, I would highlight that if you start submitting your questions now, you can do so through the Q&A function, and we will start answering them as soon as the next presentation has concluded. But with that, I would like to hand over to Paul O'Neill, our Senior Research Fellow, whose chapter looks at the reserves and contingent mass. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Jack, and good afternoon, everybody. In my chapter, as you've already heard, capacity as well as capability is important. But I think the starting point has always got to be to do what? And that's not a reserves question. It needs to take a defence perspective and consider the whole force. So I think there are probably about 5 principal choices. The first choice is being clear about what I want to achieve. As I've said, that's not a reserve question, but a defence choice. It may also be a governmental choice, which is less about military capability than it is about societal cohesion. And this is the kind of national service debate we have seen. And even if you think it doesn't make sense militarily, it may very well do politically. And it's interesting that both France and Poland have emphasised the societal output of their plans for expanding the reserve and indeed the national service that President Macron has announced. So if the first choice is about what do I want to achieve, the second choice is how do I grow the capability I want within my financial constraints? Again, that's not actually a reserves question. The requirement can be met in many ways, of which the reserves are but one. For me, too often work on the reserves begins not with the force structure, but about a force structure. That is a reserves force structure. And it focuses in on populating that reserves force structure. In the UK, the 30,000 strong army reserve of 2010's SDSR was a classic example of this. The answer may well indeed be 30,000, but that cannot be the starting question. But if we assume the answer is the reserves, the third choice is where do they add most value and how much risk am I willing to take? In the paper, I postulate 3 generic roles. I should say these are conceptual roles only. The individuals may be the same against all of them, so I'm not trying to describe a force structure, but it's a way of thinking about how you might employ reserves. The first role is what I've called supplemental. This is where the reserves are routinely employed in delivering standing defence outputs. Examples may well be the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, 77 Brigade, the RAF's Air Movement Squadron, and the cyber areas, for example, within the UK. The second conceptual role is contingent, and this is where mass is held in the reserves pending mobilisation based on events that may demand greater capacity than the regular force itself can deliver. And the third is societal, and this is where the purpose of the reserves is to be the connector between at least 2 points of Clausewitz's secondary trinity, that is the people and the armed forces. But of course, even if you look at the current defence ministerial team, the reserves can also play a role in connecting the third part of the Trinity, which is government. The fourth choice I propose is a question about how do we access and retain the reserve? And of course, that may depend on how you envisage them being employed. If defence wants a supplemental capability, then it probably needs to attract people to come and do their day job within defence. And this is not currently what most of the reserve offers around the world are primarily aimed at. Most of them are aimed at the contingent reserve. And if it is the contingent reserve, how do you offer the reserves the opportunities they're looking for within your resources, including without taking away opportunities from regular personnel to the extent that they feel frustrated and they leave? An interesting case here in reverse is the UK Civil Contingencies Reaction Force. This was created in 2002 as part of the SDR new chapter. It achieved full operating capability in 2006 and was disbanded in 2009, having never been used. It was disbanded because military commanders preferred to use regulars because that's where their sunk costs were, and didn't want to incur the additional costs of calling out the reserves in civil contingencies, even though that was the reason that particular force had been created. And if it's a societal reserve, how do you make the experience positive and financially viable, given the short period of service for which people come and join you? And this has got to be something about how defence looks to reduce the costs of recruiting and training, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. At least militarily, it may make sense politically, of course. The fifth choice I postulate is a question about how far I'm willing to change to make the reserves work. It's not just a question of the reserves, as I've said, but it also impacts on the regular component. Traditionally, I would argue reserves have been seen as lower readiness, lower cost, and if I can be a little provocative, less capable regulars. The power has always been with the regular force, but I don't think that's necessarily true in the future, especially if defences in medium powers are looking to rebalance to reserves who draw on their civilian skills in this supplemental capacity. And the question is, how far is defence willing to change across the board to make a success of this? I think there's a real and exciting role for the reserve in the force structure of the future, but it's not without cost: financial cost, organisational capacity, and cultural. So maybe the biggest choice is, how much do I want it? And what am I willing to pay to make it work? And with that, Jack, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. So we have some great questions to kick us off, and there's a huge amount of material on the table, so this may jump around a little bit. I'm going to answer them from the bottom and then go up. So the first one actually is to Justin. What would be your, how much concern should we place on the fact that Turkey is now pushing into the UCAV space in Syria, Libya, and elsewhere? What does that say about the lower cost of entry, as it were, to deploying air power on the contemporary battlefield? And if we can keep our answers brief, then we'll try and get through everyone's questions. So,
I think it's important to distinguish what Turkey is doing from the higher end UCAVs, which are being pursued by the United States, China, and Russia in particular. What Turkey has shown is the value that can be added by a competent air force with good C2 structures and coordination with ground forces, utilizing UAVs with direct command links that are not reliant on beyond line of sight, so they're less vulnerable to disruption, operating against forces that are practicing poor dispersion and with not particularly competent close-range air defense, and supported by their own electronic warfare. It's a demonstration of the power of UAVs on a modern battlefield. But again, worth remembering that the primary means of defending Syrian airspace against a state threat like Turkey would be the Russian air defense system and the Russian Air Force, neither of which was opposing the Turkish operation. So I think it's worth placing it in context, but certainly it shows the value. There is a much lower cost of entry for command line of sight style UAVs, because frankly, the airframe and weapons technology behind it is not terribly sophisticated, but it's highly efficient. So a lot of states will go down that route. The higher end UCAVs with significant stealth features, a much greater capability for autonomous decision making within a given programmed mission set, and sensors that allow them to look without giving themselves away, so low probability of intercept or detect. That's something that I think will remain pretty much the preserve of established high-end airspace manufacturers rather than the sort of mid-tier for the next 5-10 years or so, unless they start being exported. Of course, China are already offering the CH7, so we'll see how that goes.
Thanks, Justin. Next question from Chris Pike for Peter. And he highlights the fact that, Peter, you've been saying for some time that that there are certain delusions that we keep telling ourselves about C2, the future environment, etc. But that doesn't seem to get picked up in the debate that is had publicly. And there's almost this cognitive dissonance where you speak to units and they assume that they won't have access to comms because of EMS disruption. And yet everything that comes out publicly from the MOD is everything's going to be integrated, perfect C2 connectivity, etc. How do you explain that disconnect?
Well, you're right, Jack, and thanks for your question, Chris. But there is a complete disconnect. I think troops, ships, aircraft all get that there will be broken electromagnetic spectrum, that there won't be the connectivity, and yet everything we hear about, from the integrating operating concept to the rumors of the integrated review, is that the MOD is going to place its big bets on connectivity, data, and information, sort of going exactly the way that you wouldn't go if you understood what the future operating environment probably looks like. This is going to get pretty expensive. There doesn't seem to be an appetite to look at alternative means of doing it, but seniors have sort of fallen in love with the data evangelists who are peddling the snake oil that comes out. And whilst it all has a role for it, I'm not overly hopeful that we're going to see a lot of reality coming out from the integrated review that perhaps we'd want. It's going to be very good news for data and information companies. I don't think it's going to be such good news for troops at the front line. I don't think it's going to be particularly good news for the way the UK is going to be facing adversaries. But I think it's a reality that somehow we're going to have to come to live with. And it's going to require the UK over the next decade to invest more in resilience systems in order to try and make their concept of operations work for the future.
If I could just add to that, I think there's a real tendency for people to talk about everyone has to be able to talk with everyone. And when we've looked at efficient military operations in the past, we know that's not the case. So because everyone's playing with new systems, they're not necessarily prepared to say what their priorities are at the moment. But what we need, if the ambition is going to get translated into anything close to reality, is some pretty fierce prioritization around which connections are essential and which ones are nice to have or advantageous if you can access them at a given time.
Spot on, Jack. But the other thing, of course, is with the Levine model of delegation that you've got right now, is you're going to get single service priorities, but not centralized priorities. And whilst that might be the role of UK Strategic Command, there is a sort of bit of MOD central office head bashing that needs to go on in order to align those priorities. And I don't see any appetite for doing it. I don't know if you've seen that or anyone else has.
I mean, it's a great conversation we could get into, but there are a lot of questions, so I'm going to crack on. Giuseppe Cavagna, sorry if I've mispronounced your name, has asked, what is the role of NATO in the management of the Mediterranean migratory flow in light of the growing bilateral relationship between Italy and Libya, which was resulting in a constant increase of Italian military support to al-Sarraj's government? And I'd push that to, not so much on the specifics, but push it to Sid, in terms of, you very much spoke about, do we go in hard with the US or not? But how do you think navies could prioritize their bilateral relationships with a wider set of partners? And what does that mean for their military, particularly their maritime forces? Using them as a good example.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Libya is, I think, a good case of why the going hard with the US model might have certain pitfalls, because NATO doesn't really have a view on Libya, does it? I mean, if you ask, say, the Italian and French governments what the solution to providing stability in Libya would be, you would get two very different answers. So the question then is, if you were to translate that sort of political reality into force structures, it's precisely, do you want a fleet of multi-mission assets that could work bilaterally to manage migratory flows with, say, a single partner, as well as, contributing to a more sort of traditional war-fighting efforts? Or do you want that sort of force of single-purpose assets that really is built with the express purpose of battering down an anti-access wall? So in many ways, yeah, the ability to work through a series of sort of bilateral sort of groupings is possibly one of the cases to be made for an approach that sort of emphasizes hedging over a sort of a very optimized single-purpose force in the maritime domain.
Cheers. I'm going to go to a question from Keith Best now, who asks, following the point that it is now open to very few countries to take unilateral military action, I should like views on the viability and likelihood of development of European defence forces, either working cooperatively at present or in a more structured way. And I'm going to be slightly selfish and take that myself, because it allows me to get into a bit of my chapter that I didn't have time to present on. So basically, ideally, when I say there are two models between reconnaissance strike and your traditional ground maneuver forces, ideally you'd have both. And when they work together, the task of those heavy maneuver forces to take ground gets drastically easier because of the extent to which enemy forces have been thinned out by those high volume precision fires and the constraint of enemy maneuver. But the problem we have is that when you look at European militaries, certainly France, Germany, and the UK, we can't afford to do both. We are struggling to fund one coherently. In the UK's case, 3 UK Div has apparently been our main line of effort for the last 10 years. Every component of that needs modernization and is pretty close to obsolescence if you look at the core platforms. So, the problem we have is we can't do both, which does lead you very quickly to a point, given that the Russians do both, the Chinese are trying to do both, and the Americans are definitely doing both, where working with the French, working with the Germans, and the Poles, and collaborating on how do we actually bring complementary capabilities together is really critical. Maybe the projection challenge for the UK means that a focus on a really large formation of heavy armor is suboptimal compared to Germany, which is much closer. But given that the French only have 13 MLRS launchers in the whole army, maybe what we bring to the table in that context is much greater long-range precision firepower. And so, yes, I think there needs to be, if we are going to accept that we have to prioritize and probably lose some of the balance in our forces, then we also need to be a lot more open about talking about our mutual dependencies with certain defense kind of assumptions and contingency planning. If we don't do that, then I think we risk each pursuing more and more capabilities, but not actually being able to field enough munitions, enough launchers, and therefore not really having one that's coherent. And even worse, having small numbers of platforms that can't have the same spares and can't be supported in the same way. So we end up with a really messy logistics system. So yes, that is a conversation that we need to have, whether it's with a European force or whether it's through NATO and through things like the Lancaster House Agreement and the JEF, I think is a different question. So Andrew Trollen asks, we talk about sovereignty versus allies and which allies to follow. How do you gauge European NATO allies' attitude and trust of UK post-Brexit and cross-contamination of poor relations resulting from Brexit, trade agreements, etc., in relation to cooperation? And I'm going to push that to Peter, because you highlighted, to what extent do we need sovereign capabilities?
Well, I mean, the sovereign capabilities piece is, it's a very definitive choice that needs to be made. It's going to cost a huge amount going forward to retain a sovereign capability, both in command and control and in other facets. And it is one of those key choices. The fundamental one in this paper, I think, is determining whether you are going to put high-end warfighting as your fundamental defense planning assumption for your armed forces. And that, in a way, relates exactly to this question, because it is the point at which NATO is really finding it hard at the moment. I mean, in theory, philosophically, it understands that it's there for high-end warfighting, but actually it's much more comfortable with the constabulary missions that it's been used to for a while, a bit of training on the side, and things that aren't really too difficult, leaving the Americans to do the heavy lifting. The UK has sat traditionally somewhere in between and is, deeply embedded in NATO, certainly in the higher level of politics and at the higher level of militaries. And as such, I don't think NATO and NATO partners are really embroiled in the Brexit negotiations. I don't think they're watching it closely. I think they have bigger problems to which they're monitoring. You know, the Russian operations in the Baltics, special operations, Russian special operations in Scandinavia, the penetration of critical national infrastructure by Chinese companies. I mean, there is a whole host of problems, and for NATO, and Brexit is pretty low down. I haven't seen a large number of questions that are really taking this to task. Not a lot of chiefs are worrying desperately about how it's going to flop out, because of course things like the status of forces agreements occur within NATO, not within the EU. So there is some differentiation there. But I think there is some nervousness starting to arise that says, genuinely, how committed are you to Europe? Because actually we're not sure about the US and we do really need you. That hasn't been a mature discussion yet. Whether we'll get there as a mature discussion before December, or whether we're going to have it after the exit date, I'm just not altogether sure.
Cheers. I'm gonna be cheeky and take a question from a colleague within RUSI, from Nick Reynolds, but I think it's a very good question, which is, certainly with the British Army, we're looking at a trend based on CGS's comments yesterday towards more special operations and more specialist high-risk engagement, you know, localized footprint activity all over the place that requires really high competence on part of our people. And we're unlikely to see the army growing in the future. We're also likely to see a reduction in the number of people as we get further away from Afghanistan and Iraq, where you have a large pool of people who've left but have substantial combat experience. Could you comment perhaps on how we might make sure that we have a sufficient talent pool to draw upon, even while the size of the force is contracting, if the pool that we usually use to resource a specialist selected set of functions is actually, well, there are fewer people to draw from now? How do we retain people in that relationship?
To whom are you aiming that, Jack?
Paul, sorry.
I had a horrible feeling you were going to say that. Now, it is a very good question. And I think assessing the capability of a force purely by its numbers isn't necessarily always helpful. What we're seeing, I think, within defense is an increasing relevance of many commercial skills that have the potential to deliver military output. And what we may find, and we've never really embraced this fully in the context of the whole force, is that certain things that the militaries have done could be done as well, and in some cases even potentially better, by people who haven't spent 20 years in the organization. To free defense up to focus its principal effort of the regulars in those areas where the combat element is prevalent. But if you look at any of the three services, perhaps less so in the context of the Navy because of its seagoing nature, but the ratio of those who are wielding bayonets, if I can use that term collectively, to those who provide support activity is probably not optimal if I went out on a limb, not very far. So I think there are opportunities within defense to rebalance to these areas. The challenge perhaps is less so in terms of total numbers, because if you wanted to reduce the size of the regular military by a particular amount, you would obviously look to consider the whole force more broadly. Commercial providers, perhaps in engineering functions, especially where they're not deployed forward. In terms of reserves, where you need people to be in uniform, and indeed in terms of the civil service. But I think if the most expensive people are the ones you're trying to make more expensive, i.e. the more skilled you have, then the more likely you are going to have trouble in retaining them because they have skills that the external world may want, then you're likely to increase your cost base anyway. And there's a ratio of volume cost versus unit cost in people. And if you increase the unit cost of people, then you might have to reduce your volume cost by getting rid of some. For me, the challenge isn't so much the access to the talent pool, because you can change your models, you can bring them in lateral entry, you can have people for shorter periods of time, so you don't have to invest quite as much as retaining them. But if you're going to massively increase the amount of training you provide, they become more important to you and your ability to retain them. Because recruitment, I don't think, is the problem, even in the army, and I know Capita's getting better at that. The challenge is retention. And can you genuinely have special operations forces from individuals who spend relatively little time in there? What do you provide them with in terms of the respite from those operations, which we see in the Navy? A significant outflow from the Navy is people who have spent a long time at sea, who now want to spend a bit of time at home, but the Navy has managed to reduce the shore-based billets substantially. And the more and more it pushes to sending people to sea, the greater trouble it will have with retention. And I think the same may also be true for the Army. If the more it pushes people out and away from families and away from home, but gives them many more skills to make them attractive to commercial employers, the retention challenge is going to be substantial as we go forward.
Thank you very much, Paul. And the next question comes from Adam Kofi, who was Army Visiting Fellow here at RUSI, but is now back in Andover. And it's a question that I think is tailored for the person he's aimed it at, Siddharth, which is, does CGS's proposed Indo-Pacific pivot change the key findings of your report?
Well, not necessarily, because I think that same trade-off, in a sense, does get geographically displaced to the Indo-Pacific, because the UK still needs to ask itself a couple of questions. Firstly, what its policy in terms of pivoting to the Indo-Pacific will be. Will it be a primarily sort of US-centric policy, or will it be much more about creating a sort of spaghetti bowl of bilateral relationships, including with the US, but also with regional sort of partners that is complementary to, but distinct from that of the US. The second would be the nature of the military commitment. Is it a competitive presence, one that, you know, involves everything from signaling and freedom of navigations operations through to perhaps peripheral pressure, or is it primarily a sort of warfighting function? Because you know, warfighting within the first island chain would involve a very distinct sort of force structure from the one that exists today. But the force structure, the naval force structure that exists, or an evolution of it that builds on these foundations, could certainly play a competitive role. And finally, in the sort of the high intensity sort of scenario, does the UK, we ought to kind of differentiate, I'd say, the Indo-Pacific, at least in maritime terms, between the sort of the Indian Ocean area and the Western Pacific, because the sort of the projection of power into the latter would involve a particularly sort of distinct force structure, whereas arguably peripheral pressure against, you know, growing, for example, Chinese maritime, some of assets, some of which are increasingly militarized along the Belt and Road in the Indian Ocean, beyond the reach of that very dense anti-access sort of system in the first island chain, might well be possible with sort of the existing force structure, and might well sort of complement a US sort of a presence in the Western Pacific without directly being a part of it. So I'd say that the same question, even if the same sort of questions laid out in the report do kind of get displaced into an Indo-Pacific context in roughly the manner they're laid out.
Thanks, Sid. Last, I think, question before we'll have to wrap up, but pushing this to Peter, because you mentioned as one of the decision points that needs to be raised, jointery. And multi-domain integration is kind of the buzzword on Whitehall these days, which I suppose builds on the concept of jointery. So could you perhaps elaborate on what is the decision about jointery that you were trying to highlight there, just as we have time?
So it's a really interesting point, isn't it? If you look back over the evolution of Western command and control, this push towards, from combined into jointery, through comprehensive whole of government, fused and now integrated, all seems to be based on a conclusion that somehow consensus decision making is better than a single commander. And it caused me to look at the idea of jointery in a slightly new way. And I'll be regarded as a real heretic on Whitehall here for saying that I'm not necessarily a believer in it. There are circumstances where jointery, to me, weakens the decision-making and fighting capabilities of the single services, probably in critical battles. why should, in a land campaign in a landlocked country, why should the Navy in a joint headquarters be trying to drive the answers to the question? There are times when there are single service priorities which would make decision making faster, more agile, with a better background and understanding than we get through jointry, where in many ways we have to explain every single situation to every single person in the headquarters as a starting point. For example, if you're looking at Operation Adana, logically this is simply held by the RAF. It requires airspace managers with a detailed understanding of the capabilities of their own jets to make split-second decisions about the safety of UK airspace and potential threats to it. It's absolutely something the RAF are to do. This is not something that requires us or should require us to want to spend days, weeks and years training joint officers for a single job for which there are others better placed to do so. In the same way, the Navy could make the same point about the nuclear deterrent and others. So the idea that everything focuses through jointry, the jointry is the single panacea for everything, to me is a little bit of it's disingenuous to the realities of the situation and the complexities of single service domains. Joint officers can't understand everything, they can't be experts at everything, and we have, as taxpayers, paid dedicated officers in each of the environments to come to those conclusions themselves. Now, don't get me wrong, there are elements in which jointry works and is exceedingly useful, but should it be regarded as a panacea, as a blanket answer for everything? Well, to me, the answer is absolutely not, and nor should we get caught up in a sort of evangelistic way of thinking about integration and fusion as a single answer that will provide the right responses in every circumstance.
Cheers, Peter. I'm very sorry. There are a couple of questions that have just come in, but we're rapidly approaching the end point. And I just quite quickly want to flag that I think one of the things that's very consistent across a lot of the chapters, and following on from the point about jointery, is that a lot of the advantages of joint structures are quite contextually specific. That it's not axiomatically better. And what we almost need in the integrated review, because we're facing some pretty difficult trade-offs, is a clear articulation of where the advantages lie and where they don't lie, where we do pursue certain capabilities and where we don't, which integration systems we absolutely require, whether that's the kill chains on our long-range precision fires, or another type of capability, and where we're actually going to accept some risk and rely on training and tactics from our people to get around the technological limitations and the threat that is imposed by the adversary. And also perhaps within the services, a clear articulation of the boundaries of what they're proposing to be able to do. For example, if the RAF is going to be pursuing SEAD-DEAD as its primary task, it's not going to have much combat mass available to support ground forces, and a very large amount of habit within ground forces and the army about the support they receive from the air will have to change. And admitting the limits that close air support is probably not going to be available, and stating that very clearly, can then drive the conversation about what do we do as a result of that gap. So I think stating the limits of ambition is in many ways critical to solving some of the gaps that emerge by virtue of having to prioritize our capability. So I hope that that's been interesting. It's really only a taster of all of the facets that are in the various chapters. And I do hope that if you're a RUSI member, which is only £89 now to access digitally if you want to join the Institute, then you can access all of this work from our website, along with all of our other reports. Alternatively, it is available, I believe, from Amazon, or if it's not uploaded immediately after this, it will be very shortly. And it will be being sent out as well by RUSI. So I hope that you are able to read it, and I look forward to the discussion that it generates and the feedback that we receive. So with that, I would like to thank you all for attending, and I look forward to hearing from you soon. Cheers.